I would now like to introduce our luncheon speaker. We're very pleased to have Richard Rubin joining us to speak to us. Richard is the U.S. tax policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C. Richard focuses on the intersection of taxes, politics, and economics. He was the Journal's lead reporter on the development of the 2017 Tax Act and continues to cover the impact of the law. Before joining the Wall Street Journal in 2015, Richard covered tax policy for Bloomberg News and Congressional Quarterly. He also wrote about local government and transportation policy for the Charlotte Observer. He is a native of the great state of New Jersey and a graduate of Duke University. With that, Richard?
Good. Thank you. Eric, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for having me. I wanted to start by congratulating everyone who's here, because out of 993, you're the ones who survived 2 nights on Bourbon Street. So we're all here. We've made it. It really is actually a treat to be up here. I managed to get here without taking the LSAT, without borrowing $1 for law school, and without passing the bar exam. And instead, partly through inertia and luck, and partly because I didn't want to sit in classrooms anymore, I found my way into a job where I get to ask impertinent questions. The more impertinent, the better. The more questions, the better. And then the results get printed hundreds of thousands of times and land on your doorsteps. As a tax reporter, I've toured factories, questioned presidential candidates, celebrated the New Year in the Capitol building, and been filmed wearing a bathing suit with my arm around inflatable currency. I did. I've learned enough about the tax code to be dangerous, and enough to recite a disclaimer every spring when other reporters in our office wander over to my desk and start asking for personal tax advice. I'm going to talk today about what I do as a tax reporter, how I do it, and then attempt to tie that to a bit of a broader view about the role of the press in the tax world. And I'll happy to turn the tables and take questions too. But it's at that incongruity, the idea of being a non-lawyer in a room full of lawyers, that I want to start. The tax world, as I think about it, sometimes is made up of a series of groups that collaborate and sometimes compete. The lawyers, economists, politicians, accountants, that each approach this subject with their own mindset. And I don't live in any of those worlds. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an economist, I'm not a politician, I'm not an accountant. I've never worked for the government unless you count my hometown's recreation department in the mid-90s. I've just been doing this for 12 years now, and I don't consider myself really self-taught when it comes to tax. I'm, in a different way, I consider myself all of you taught, because I've learned it through the process of reporting stories on everything from AMT to the Wayfair decision to the 999 plan and beyond. And I'm still learning, both from lawyers as I talk to you, and then also from people in those other disciplines too. And my separation, my distance from any of those disciplines, I think and hope gives me a helpful vantage point. It means that I don't approach every story from a legal perspective or an economic one or a political one, because there's dimensions of all of those in every piece. And so the most interesting questions that I try to answer for our readers are the ones that really cross those disciplines. Has the 2017 tax law delivered the promised amount of investment and growth? Why or why not? How will the government shutdown affect taxpayers in this year's filing season? What would happen if Congress sharply raised the top marginal tax rate? In this 12 years that I've been covering taxes, I've had to learn law, accounting, politics, business, and economics, certainly not well enough to practice, but well enough to mostly understand those worlds and attempt to explain them for the much broader audience that I'm trying to write for. People who care about taxes, but don't necessarily spend their days and nights thinking about taxes like you do, and like I do. And so that translation function is a big part of what I see my job as. The general rule of thumb is this, that I need to understand whatever subject I'm writing about at a technical level that's about 2 layers below and deeper than whatever appears in print. And if I've ever interviewed, and I definitely see people here I've talked to, I can see how that might be frustrating. We might spend a half hour on the phone talking through the history and function and regulations of 355 or 1031 or whatever it is, and maybe 2 sentences of that will end up in print. And I can see how that's, like, why did I spend time with that guy? But what did I get out of this, right? But without that half hour, I might have missed something important or gotten something wrong. And so my goal here isn't to write for the people in this room. That in itself is really laudable, and I applaud and marvel at my colleagues at Tax Notes and Bloomberg and Law 360 and elsewhere who do that, who have to try to understand some arcane piece of the tax code at a level or 2 deeper than you do. Instead, my goal is to write about tax policy for an audience that, for lack of a better term, we could call educated and curious Americans, to keep them informed. But I aim to do that in a way where the people in this room don't read what I say and say, oh, he has no idea what he's talking about. As an aside, if it ever seems like I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, whether you're reading that or we're talking in an interview, please say so. Not right now. Not right now. But I welcome that. And, because I do always want to be first with every story. It's sort of the competitive nature of the business, and I want to produce news and analysis that nobody else has. But more important than that is getting it right. So I do actually welcome the constructive criticism. So I want to go back to that audience, our readers, because that's really at the core of what I'm trying to do. It's not just about translation, it's about seeing myself as an agent of those readers. And our readers want to know how taxes affect their companies, whether they own them or work for them. They want to know how taxes will affect them personally. They want to use that information to make decisions about their lives and their businesses. They want to know who has influence when Treasury and IRS are writing rules. And our readers count on us to ask tough questions to find out information. Our readers want to know what's going to change in Washington and what will stay the same. They want us to describe and analyze campaign tax proposals so they can make informed judgments about who they should support or oppose. They want to know if people and businesses are paying their fair share. And of course, every reader has his or her own idea of what fair means. And I want to linger on that for a minute. One of the joys of working for the Wall Street Journal is that we have a very ideologically diverse readership. If you just want to hang out in my inbox after I write a story, you're welcome. You'd see it. And our editorial page, of course, has a very clear leaning, but that really has zero bearing on what I do. It's not a pat phrase. Our news side operates completely independently of the opinion side. But the readers, maybe perhaps because many are attracted by the editorial page, are actually all over the place politically and geographically. So I'm reaching those educated, curious people of America, the college professor in Massachusetts, the tech worker in Silicon Valley, the car dealer in Florida. Just this morning, I had an email I wrote a story yesterday about the 199 CAFE regs, and I had an email from a real estate professional in Northern Virginia with a question, and a rancher in Texas with a question. And that's totally, with very detailed questions about their specific situations, and I give them my disclaimer. But that's an example of the kind of audience that we have, and it's not just tax people, it's not just New York and DC only. And unlike a lot of news organizations these days, we're very trusted across the political spectrum. So it's important for me to try and keep my work readable and credible for that broad audience. It doesn't mean pulling punches or over-punching. It just means remembering who's reading and that potentially everybody is reading. And it means constantly having that devil's advocate view in my head. and to try and understand for readers, both to explain, well, this is just the way it is, but then also sometimes to question, well, why is it? Why does the tax code work that way? Eric wanted me to talk a bit, too, about how I choose what stories to write. And to me, it really comes back to thinking about what readers want. Sometimes what they consciously say they want in terms of practical information, and sometimes what they want because they've essentially contracted with the journal to be their eyes and ears in the tax world. And frankly, the hardest part of picking what to write is choosing what not to write. I've got this whole long list of ideas of things I'd like to get to and just can't get there. So I'm constantly deciding, no, that doesn't affect enough people. No, there's not enough money at stake there. No, I just wrote about that last week. No, that's too incremental development. Let's wait till that some more happens in that area and I'll write about it some. And most of my stories are not assigned in the sense of an editor walking over to my desk and saying, this is what you're doing today. Sometimes it happens like that, but usually it's pretty obvious where I need to spend my time. Because I have such a wide area, all of U.S. federal tax policy, there's a blizzard of news. What's in the latest House tax bill and will it pass? How will the Democrats attempt to get the president's tax returns? And it moves really fast. Yesterday, right, so the 199 Cap A regs came out yesterday. I had to have 200 words on the website the moment that the regs came out publicly, and then I had about 1,000 words 3 hours later. So if you saw me sitting upstairs in the restaurant going like this, like a crazy person, like that's why. It's because, people, there's sort of an expectation in this fast-paced world that we're providing instant analysis really, really quickly. Things that would, 10 or 15 years ago would have been a second-day story. Write the news the first day, analyze it the next day. It's all compressed. And then I'm always looking at the obvious bigger questions in this post-tax reform era. That's a whole term that I don't usually use in print, but be simple. Who wins from the beat regs? How is the international system working? How are states trying to work around the SALT cap? How is the IRS trying to stop states from working around the SALT cap? How are states and taxpayers trying to work around the ways the IRS is trying to prevent the workarounds? And then so there's that whole bucket of things. And then I'm constantly working with other teams around our newsroom. We have a personal finance tax writer in New York, and then there's me, but there's plenty of people who interact with us. So we've got DC reporters who cover economic data and politics and Congress and financial regulation. They need tax policy help from me, and I need their expertise at times. We have teams around the world that are covering markets and companies. And because tax intersects with everything, I intersect with almost everyone in our newsroom at one point or another. I think the biggest exception is really the people who cover national security. But other than that, I have to work with a lot of people all around the country and all around the world. And then I've got some freedom to follow my own curiosity. Conservation easements, for example, aren't the most enormous, consequential thing in terms of revenue, but I find them interesting, and I get to spend some time on them, and I watch them. I also have some freedom, as some of you know, to make goofy tax videos to explain taxes to the broader public, and I actually have heard professors tell me they show them in class as for intro tax students. And so, I'll write 100,000 words over the course of a year about every complicated piece of tax policy, and then everyone's like, okay, fine, touch one cow on video, and everyone, to make a point about tax reform, and no one wants to ask me about anything else. So beyond just looking out for the reader, what's the role of the press in the tax world? So we're here, like I said, in part to explain what you do, to translate from tax into something that I can pack into 800 or 1,000 words of English. We're here to show who wins and who loses, who's up and who's down. We're also here to bring a critical eye, to be the economist in a room full of lawyers, the conservative in a room full of liberals, the liberal in a room full of conservatives, to be skeptical about everything we hear without being too cynical. We're here to ask not just what is happening, but why it's happening, but also why it couldn't happen some other way. And sometimes we're here to find out truths that you might not want us to find. So as I wrap up, I want to close by encouraging you to be an active consumer and participant in tax news. If something important is happening or developing and people aren't talking about it publicly, or it's not getting the attention it deserves, tell us. I prefer you tell me, of course, but tell someone. Don't assume that we know something. That actually happens a lot, where I'll be talking to someone, well, everybody knows that this is, how it's working right now, and this is the transaction everyone's doing. I'm like, well, no, I didn't necessarily know that. I was covering, that's an international, and I was writing about pass-throughs for a week. Engage with us. We don't bite, usually. I have go-to experts in a whole bunch of sub-areas within the tax law, but I always want a broader, bigger, and more diverse pool of sources. At this point, I'm happy to reverse the usual manner of things and take some questions. Happy to talk about anything I've discussed here. I can try and give some perspective on what I see happening or not in tax policy in Washington. If you want, I can talk about cows too. Thank you. And there's microphones here if anyone makes it easier for me to hear.
I have a question regarding your opinion on technical corrections. A lot of people have said that it is unlikely because of the political climate to get technical corrections passed, but do you think the Democrats will play ball for technical corrections that effectively increase taxes? Maybe not all technical corrections, but ones that would fix issues with the tax law that perhaps provide a benefit, unintended benefit.
Yeah, so I think two things will govern that. The first is time. So Chairman Neal has talked about starting a whole series of hearings on how the TCJA is working, and they're going to want to go through that, at least some of that process before they start moving legislation to change it. That could be, I put it on the order of months maybe, but I think they're going to want to lay out a record not just in technicals but also in substantive concerns that they have. And then the second thing is it's a trade. And I think this wasn't technically a technical, but the model is the grain glitch 199 Cap A cooperative fix from a year ago, where there was something that was having immediate effect, like some of these technicals that affects Republican and Democratic constituencies alike, and they all kind of looked at each other and said, well, we need to fix this now or it's going to have like big market effects, particularly in agricultural states, and they cut a deal. There was a price, right? In that case, the price was an expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, and I don't know what the price will be for technicals. I'm not sure the Democrats know what the price will be for technicals, but you can imagine sometime in the summer or fall there being a technicals for something trade. But I'm watching that, and we'll kind of just see how that develops, but that's sort of the outline of where it'll go.
Rich, can you talk a little bit about cooperation and competition among the tax reporters?
Yeah, it's a really collegial bunch. So there's both, I think, cooperation and competition. There's definitely times when, I don't always tell people what I'm working on. They can sometimes intuit that if we happen to be both talking to the same member of Congress at the same time, based on what I'm asking. But it's a small, there's several groups, right? So there's like the tax reporters on the Hill, and then there's tax reporters, who are covering IRS or regs. And so everyone's pretty friendly. You would think there'd be more like, it's not like, it's competitive in the sense that everyone wants to be like first, and I want everyone to talk to me and not to them, but I'm also like there are definitely times when I read stories and that other people write, and I say, oh man, I wish I had gotten to that. That was a smart idea, and I'm glad they saw that and wrote that.
I used to be a news reporter before I went to law school, and I'm just wondering, what are the 2 most impertinent questions you've ever asked?
That's a good. I'm going to give you one, which actually I didn't ask to a source. This was when I interviewed for my first job in Charlotte. They brought me in to interview with the deputy managing editor, and I think one of the first questions that she's like, so she asked me a bunch of questions, and then she said, "Do you have any questions?" I'm like, "What does a deputy managing editor do?" I'm like, "What? I don't know who you are and what you do." And I think that actually helped me get the job, because it was it's an example of like as in taxes, you just want to step back, and this happens a lot. Like I'll be talking to someone and they'll be 2 levels deeper than I was, and I said, wait a minute, can you just like back up? Like, I have a baseline of knowledge, but like, let's just start with like the code section, and then it's like just walk me through it like 2 more steps. I wish I had a better example of an pertinent question. Anyone? Go for it.
If you were a betting reporter, how long do you think the 21% top corporate tax rate is really going to be in effect, based on all your interviews of all these policy players?
So I think it at least lasts through January 20th of 2021 as a starter. And beyond that, I think it's certainly vulnerable, because it's an easy dial for Democrats to turn if and when they have full control. And so what I would watch is watch the proposals coming out of the Hill, but also watch where the presidential candidates go on the Democratic side, and how do people say just we're going to raise corporate taxes, or are they going to say 25 or 28? I don't think you'll hear some who will want to go back to 35. That's not going to happen, I don't think. I think in some ways, look, like, Democrats wanted to lower the rate, and they opposed other things in the law and didn't vote for it, but that was getting it somewhere in the mid-20s was never something they objected to. How they got there is the issue, but it's an easier dial to turn, and that's why I think it's more, in some ways, more vulnerable than the international structure or some of the individual pieces, because they'll just have and you just run this rubric in your head of, I don't know if it's still $100 billion a point, but it'll be something like that, and they'll know, well, if we raise it to 25, we've got $400 billion to spend on whatever, and that's, if you're proposing a whole long list of things you want to spend money on, having an easy, not from your perspective, but from their perspective, source of revenue to go for is attractive. It's not going to happen. I think, but I think there will clearly the energy in the party is to raise. It was there under the Obama administration. The Obama administration left office not with the proposal for 70, but with proposals to make the 3.8% tax apply much more broadly to active business income, to step up in basis of death. There's a whole range of things that they had if you go back and look at the last Green Book. And I think that's probably where the consensus will start. And that may include more at the top end on the marginal rate, but I think the full proposals as they develop over the course of 2020 in preparation for 21 potentially are likely to be, how do we, see in Democrat hat, how do we make the tax code overall more progressive and tax more income of high-income people, not necessarily thinking of that rate as the only lever, but it's, maybe that moves people more to be more willing to be in the high 40s and 50s than they might have been otherwise. And just to add to that, of course, like the public sentiment has shifted, and like the public is maybe not at 70, but public is perfectly fine raising taxes on high-income people. Yeah.
Richard, a year ago, soon after the passage of the new law, there was a lot of talk among the states that, particularly states where there were high deductions, that there would be a windfall for those states. I noticed recently in Maryland, where I happen to live, that on the list of things that are on the agenda for the state legislature this year, there was narrow mention of doing anything about the windfall. And I just wondered whether you're hearing that, or whether that's something that's just not going to happen, and whether indeed there's a big windfall, and whether there's going to be any kind of backlash against that.
So that's an area that because there's 44 or 45 different things happening, it's been very difficult for me to track exactly which states, I need to spend more time looking at which states have coupled, decoupled, lowered rates, not. It's hard to know how salient state taxes are, and like when will it be that taxpayers, if they were to be irritated by that windfall, because that's who would drive it, like when do they notice that? When do they say, wait a minute, my federal tax bill went down, but now I've got this big state tax bill that how and when do people sort of grasp that? And I assume we'll start seeing that as people start filing returns in the next couple of months, that they'll see that. Some states have, Utah or Idaho, I think, lowered rates. Like there have been some states that have given back the windfall. Minnesota, I think, is tied up because the legislature is split and they haven't done it. And other states are perfectly happy to pocket the money and spend it on stuff, or rainy day funds or whatever. So I think there's been a mix of answers out there that have mostly been kind of responsive to the political climates in those states. And the weird thing too, you have to separate the windfalls. So I think in some states, especially where the combined federal state marginal rate went up, some of those states are saw early 2018 bumps in capital gains revenue because people realized before they lost the state and local deduction at the end of 17. So they have to sort of tease out those one-time effects too.
So what's your most influential or favorite business book or memoir, and why?
Influential or favorite business book or memoir? I just read, it's got a big tax section in it too. Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Shoe Dog, and it's really good. It's all about the period from when he started the company to when it went public. So I thought it was going to be I got it, and I thought it was going to be the whole period, when it was like this big famous company, but it was all the just fights with suppliers and fights with the service too. That he went through in that whole died like 3 or 4 deaths, and so it's like you don't necessarily come out of it like liking the guy, but you kind of come out of it admiring the energy and effort it took to build that thing. And she's back.
So do you think opportunity zones are going to work as they're intended to work?
Well, wait, let's come back to the microphone. How would you describe what the intention of them was?
I wondered when I formed my question if you would ask. Well, I guess I look at them as an intention of helping lower income areas or areas that need investment that can't get investment without the tax incentives.
So if you define it as that, then yes, I think so. I think there's a ton of, I cannot Okay. You know which lawyers contact me a lot is people who are starting opportunity zone practices. I have all of your names. I've heard, I know. You're
So maybe you should answer my question as how you would define they should work.
Right. No, I'm going to get to answer your question because it's, so I think there's obviously a lot of interest. There's a lot of money going into it. There's all these funds that are forming, and the regs obviously need some adjusting as it goes forward to make it workable. But that's going to happen. The investing and the projects are going to happen. The real question, the reason I said yes to your question is because you said low-income areas. And I think that's the real unknown question is even if there's an increased investment in low-income areas, how will that meaningfully change the lives of low-income people who live in those areas? And that, I think, is much more uncertain. If you're an existing low-income property owner in those zones, you're good, right? I mean, you cash out and you're fine. But it's just not clear that the jobs, even if 5 or 10 years from now there are more jobs in those zones than there were before, that doesn't necessarily mean that those jobs went to or directly or even indirectly helped the people whose low incomes made those zones qualify for the benefit in the first place. So it's very tricky. That's the real question that along with sort of where the money goes, but that question of not just where the money goes, but who is helped by it is the thing that I'll be watching on that program.
My question has to do with what is your sense of how Democrats in Congress and prospective Democratic presidential candidates, how are they going to address the financing of Medicare for all? Are they thinking that they're going to be raising the FICA tax or raising the top rate and saying that that's going to be responsible for paying for it? Or in the alternative, if they don't get single payer, will they make an effort to revive the shared responsibility payment? What are those conversations like right now?
It's early. I think they'll start with, for Democrats, this is the benefit of the TCJA, which is that there's now maybe not a full $1.5 trillion, but a big pile of pay-fors they can use that are literally just, we're not really raising taxes. We're just rolling back tax cuts that were to high-income people that were put in place, in the Trump administration. So that actually helps them make their case as opposed to starting from a baseline that was, where it was at the end of 2016. So I think they'll start there, and I think you'll see that sort of, there's two things. One is you'll see that balance sort of shift over the course of the campaign as people will start winnowing down their proposals and increasing their revenue to try and make them line up. And then at the same time, you'll have some who will start arguing more to think about the costs differently, to think about not just the government accounting costs, but if you actually can produce savings by shifting people from the health insurance they're in now into some sort of broader system. And so the paying for it is about would come from reducing costs within the system, the healthcare system, as opposed to necessarily something on the tax side. I think it's messy, but it's worth paying attention to all of those proposals because, all of the core pieces of the ACA the elements of it were all on the table during the 2008 campaign. And so, if this campaign will certainly kind of lay out exactly where people are willing to go. And there's so many, the other thing is there's so many candidates that it's like very tricky to cover, but it's also tricky to figure out like whose ideas are sort of rising.
Do you think that the president's tax returns will ever be produced?
I don't know. I mean, look, they will take a run at them, right? At some point this year, the chairman will send a letter, he'll invoke 6103F, and off we go. And it's not, the Treasury has been, all they've said is, we'll comply with the law. Well, okay, I don't know what that means, right? Like, there's precedent, but it's also untested. So I think, and then you get in these inter-branch disputes. So it's somewhere between probably not and maybe. Would you guys call that a no opinion letter? Is that what it is? Yeah. It's one of those, yeah. I think there's going to be a big fight over it, and it's going to be really contentious, and but I could not make a prediction for you on how it lands, because it's going to depend. They'll litigate it, I would think. So unless they come out in some other fashion, right? If I don't know, assume the special counsel has them, right? And so in whatever he produces, you could see pieces of it. And that's the other thing, too, is to remember just broadly that the Ways and Means Committee has two choices on the scope to think about. One is the scope of the request. So, right, they can request anything that the service has, anything that's defined as return information, I think, right, or taxpayer information in 6103. That could include audit correspondence. It can include, schedules. It can include returns from the partnerships. All of that is, or they could just limit it to very much, X years of 1040. I don't know what they're going to do. They haven't said. And then the second scope question is that they have the ability. So the Ways and Means Committee the chairman would get them if he got them from Treasury. They'd review them in closed session, and then a vote of the Ways and Means Committee could make something public. And so the second scope question is what the something is. Something could be everything. They could just say, you know what, we'll just crowdsource it, and you guys can just go to town and look at it. The something could also be like it was in the 501c4 investigation from a few years ago, a report that redacts counterparties, redacts social security numbers, redacts, has some joint tax summary at the top that tries to, after some amount of time, make sense of what the documents say. So there's a continuum of we'll see them versus we won't, but there's also the continuum of what it actually is that might be made public. All right, good. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.